Hi everyone and welcome to today's Sheffield Museums Live. Today we are at the wonderful Kelham Island Museum where we reopened a couple of weeks ago now, so you can come and visit us in person as well. But for today's virtual event we are looking at the Sheffield-Simplex cars with our Head of Historic Engineering, Eddy Foster. And we are a charity, so if you enjoy today's virtual talk, you can donate at museums-sheffield.org.uk/donate, and we are very grateful for any donations we receive. And also, do feel free to put in the comments box below any questions or comments that you have, or if you enjoy it, please do let us know as well. So on that note, I think we are all good to go, so we will head over to Eddy now to begin the talk.
Hello and welcome to Kelham Island Museum. I'm Eddy Foster. I'm going to talk about Sheffield-Simplex Motor Company. We've had two Sheffield-Simplex cars in the collection for a good while now. We've had the 1921 car since the early 90s, and then we just recently, 2 or 3 years ago, got the 1910 car loaned to the museum, so we now have two on display. There are only 3 cars in existence, the other one's in Australia. We'll start with the history of the company. Back in the late 1800s, motor cars had only just been invented, and little companies were springing up making cars, and very good companies were springing up making luxurious cars. One of the people really interested in the dawn of the motoring industry was the 7th Earl of Fitzwilliam. He's famous for being big in the coal industry and owning Wentworth Woodhouse over in Barnsley, and he was mad for cars. So prior to Sheffield-Simplex Company coming into existence, he was on the board of directors of another motor car manufacturer called Brotherhood Crocker, and they were based in London. But they had some difficult logistics. They had 2 factories, one on either side of the Thames. So they were making parts on one side of the Thames, assembling them on the other, and it was a bit nonsensical. So the 7th Earl of Fitzwilliam offered up a piece of land at Tinsley, and he started building one big bespoke motor manufacturing site. This took a couple of years, and it cost the Earl over £11,000, which in sort of 1900 was a lot of money. By the time they built the factory, the other shareholders in Brotherhood Crocker had bowed out of the car manufacturing industry, so they left the 7th Earl of Fitzwilliam as the only and sole proprietor of Sheffield-Simplex Motorworks. So they started building cars in the early 1900s. And in the early 1900s, the technology around gearboxes was very difficult, really difficult to change gear. So they designed a gearless car, essentially a car that was so powerful you could start in one gear, which would get you rolling, and in most instances you could point it anywhere you wanted to go in that one gear and it would manage. And that's the 1910 model that's next to me. So this is from 1910, and it's the only one in existence of its kind. This came into the museum 2 or 3 years ago on loan from Anthony Hinchcliffe. The 1921, which I'm now leaning on, was the last car produced. They did really well, Sheffield-Simplex, at making luxury cars. It was all the Earl was interested in making, and they were rivaling Rolls-Royce for quality, for speed, for refinement. They were as expensive, if not more expensive, than a Rolls-Royce. These were made for people like dukes and earls and kings. The Tsar of Russia had some Simplex cars, not just one. So they made luxury cars. Right up until the start of World War I, and then they stopped production of cars, so did Rolls-Royce, and they were working for the War Office. Simplex were making armoured cars, and they were making aerial engines for aeroplanes. After World War I ended, 1919, there was a huge amount of post-war austerity, so nobody had money for luxury cars. Rolls-Royce were a partnership and had a board of directors, so they decided amongst themselves concentrate on the cheaper line of their cars, and they managed to survive post-war austerity. Sheffield-Simplex Motorworks was only run by the 7th Earl of Fitzwilliam, who saw this as a weak point and thought, right, I'm going to make the most expensive, most luxurious car in the world. I'm going to beat Rolls-Royce. And this is the prototype car that was to go into production. It was a prototype in 1920 with a different body on, and they took it to Olympia motor shows. but for 12 months nobody ordered a luxury car because nobody had any money. They rebodied it and put this curious body on it that it has now, and it was a prototype again in 1922, and again for 12 months, because of post-war austerity, nobody ordered any cars. The motorworks finished the cars that had been in production prior to the war and sold those on, but they bowed out of motor manufacturing in 1922. At that point, this car was first registered for the road as a road-going prototype, and it was first registered to the 7th Earl Fitzwilliam. So he took it off to his stately home and he exported it to Kelham in Ireland, which is his Irish mansion house, the biggest mansion house, I think, even now still in existence in Ireland. So it led rather a cosseted existence in Ireland. And then at a much later date, when the Earl died, it got sold on. It's been to America in a collection, it's been to the south of France in a collection, came back to England, and then it came up for sale in the 90s. And Sir Norman Adsets bought it. And Sir Norman Adsets at that time was the first chairman of our museum trust. So as he left some years later as chairman, he donated it to the collection. So we own this car. I'll just lift the bonnet for you. So under there you've got a nearly 8-litre engine, 7,773 cc's. And it's a straight 6, and it's got twin ignition, so it's got a magneto setup, which is what was traditional at that time, and it's one of the earliest cars that had a coil and distributor as well. But rather than scare potential customers that were used to magnetos, they put 2 systems on it, so it was sold as a reliability function. So it runs on both systems simultaneously, but if one were to fail, it will run perfectly well and drive you home on one system. Curiously, back then, the RAC told manufacturers what they could rate their engines at. Some curious sum to do with cubic capacity. They derived what your power should be. And they deemed this to be a 50 horsepower car, which was 5 horsepower more powerful than the most powerful Rolls-Royce at the time. So they really genuinely were beating Rolls-Royce technology-wise and luxury-wise. This has been on a rolling road, and it makes more than 100 horsepower. But it's 19 feet long and it weighs nearly 3 tons, so it's no ball of fire on the road. It's got masses and masses and torque, straight up into top gear, and much like the gearless car, you don't change it down very often. It does have a 4-speed gearbox, and it's quite the handful on the road. And everywhere from Kelham Island Museum is out into traffic and uphill. But once you're out into Derbyshire or on a big A road, it's quite the joy to drive. It's a 2-seater, and then it has 2 dicky seats at the back, so you can fit 4 people in it, although I don't think I'd want to travel in the back. It's got 2 roofs, the front's got a windscreen, the back's not, so again, not pleasant in foul weather. And it's quite a traditional set of pedals for driving and 4-speed with a traditional clutch. It's difficult to drive. It's only got drum brakes front and rear with no servos and no hydraulics, so it's a big effort to stop. It's just nearly 2022. It's nearly 100 years old now, so we were going to have a big birthday party for it last year. I suppose we could say it's 100 years old again in 2022 because it was a prototype after that. So with that in mind, we've done some repairs over this winter. The seams on the roof had split, the material's fine, but the stitching had rotted out. So our resident mechanic conservator Keith Wall taught himself how to double line stitch and stitch the roof back together again. He did both roofs. It was a labour of love. He was quite fed up of needles and thimbles by the time he'd finished. And then he turned his attention to the engine. We'd done valve clearances a couple of years ago and it transformed the power of the engine. So we stripped the side off the engine to be able to get the valves out this last winter, cleaned the valves, reground the valves back into their seats, and we took care of a lot of water leaks that we were struggling with on the other side without taking it all to pieces. And we repaired the exhaust, so it's in a lot better situation now, engine-wise and reliability-wise, than it was previously. We just need a new battery and then we'll be able to go out on the road again, because both of these cars go out to shows on an ordinary summer. We might get to Chatsworth this year, and there's Penistone show as well late on in the season, so we might get out twice this year. That's all from me, and enjoy your visit when you come to the museum and come and see our cars.
Hi everyone. Well, I hope you enjoyed finding out more about the Sheffield-Simplex cars. They're really beautiful and really interesting stories. We're lucky to have those in the museum. Eddie's just finished now and he's just going to come over and answer a couple of questions. So thank you for that talk, that's really interesting. So we just had a couple of questions. Have you driven it yourself then?
Yes, I've been driving the 1920 for 6 or 7 years. The mechanic that used to look after it for Norman Adsett taught me how to drive in it, and for the first couple of years I used to tell the CEO he's not paying me enough money on days that I'm driving the Simplex because it's really difficult, and the responsibility to take a car out that's unique and value for insurance on the road at £170,000. It's a bit beyond what I normally drive on a day, but it's a pleasure to drive once you've accomplished being able to drive it. So yes, it is a pleasure once you got it.
Yeah, lovely. And that goes to our second question. How do you get it in the museum?
Historically, it used to be on the lower mezzanine, and we used to have to lift it on and off of that with a fork truck, and everybody used to be very, very nervous. So we decided we were going to create the upper transport gallery, which sounds even worse, but the upper transport gallery has a ramp. So we opened some doors under the bridge downstairs in the cobbled lane, and we can drive up a ramp and into this space, and there's a turntable in this space because the building was converted into a depot, so all the Sheffield Corporation bin wagons and things used to drive up that ramp onto the turntable and then queue up down here for the night. So yeah, we're using the depot as it was originally designed for.
Amazing. And lastly, how many miles to the gallon does it go?
Very little. We think probably 8 or 9 miles to the gallon. It's got quite a big tank on it, and we can get to Chatsworth and back a couple of days in a row before we have to top up, so it's all right.
It's not super efficient.
It's not super efficient.
Okay, brilliant. Well, thank you so much. That was really interesting. I really enjoyed looking at those. And do keep an eye out for other upcoming talks and tours behind the scenes as part of Sheffield Museums Live coming up next week. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.